Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Chris Dost, the pastor of Northville Baptist Church in New Milford, Connecticut, and I'm really glad that you're here for our discussion of John Brown today with Alliance Theological Seminary professor and author Dr. Louis A DeCaro Jr. Before we begin our discussion, though, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and to like this video so that we know to keep producing more material like this for you. Well, without further ado, let's talk with Dr. DeCaro. And I have the honor of having my colleague and friend, Dr. Louis A DeCaro Jr., with me today. Dr. DeCaro holds a PhD from New York University and is an instructor in history and theology at Alliance Theological Seminary in New York City. He's a biographer of Malcolm X and the abolitionist John Brown, the latter subject having occupied his scholarship for the last 20 years, and it includes several books. His most recent works are Freedom's Dawn, The Last Days of John Brown in Virginia, and The Untold Story of Shields Green, The Life and Death of a Harpers Ferry Raider. His podcast, John Brown Today, is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other major directories. Well, Dr. DeCaro, I'm so happy to have you here with me today. Thank you for making the time to join us.
Good to see you. Thank
Great
you.
to see you too. So for those who are watching, I had the honor and privilege of working alongside Lou at Alliance Theological Seminary for many years, where we became friends. But he also really earned my admiration and respect, not only for his scholarship, but also the impact that he had on the student body there. And so it's great to have him here. So Lou, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get into the field of history and Bible and theology?
Well, one time I was at a conference once, and a historian turned to me and said, "So, were you born looking back, or were you converted?" And I suppose that I was born looking back. So I was one of those kids that thought a lot about the past, even in a very childlike way. So I've always interested in history. Was always interested in biblical history, but I think I found myself more personally compelled by, as I got older, U.S. history and then even Black history. So it kind of came, in stages. But I've maintained an interest, of course, in church history. Formally, I teach Christian history. And I teach historical theology. I sort of backed into theology as a historian. So I love theology. At least I love classical theology. So I teach, survey. That's not my in-depth area, but so history, I have a passion for it. And the John Brown thing came as a result of studying African-American history, and then sort of looking at the story of John Brown and beginning to believe that perhaps a lot of the popular notions about him were not fair. And the more I dug into it, the more I found actually that my instinct was correct. And part of that actually came from Malcolm X, because Malcolm X sort of had a rule of thumb that he said you have to watch when you look at what the broad culture, largely white society, what they say about people. If they say somebody's really bad, you ought to look closer, because you might find that there's something there, worth looking at. I'm paraphrasing him. And the
Sure.
people that are often presented and upheld as being heroes need to be examined as well in a negative light. And I find that to be the case often. So
Now, what was it that got you into Black history?
that's a good question. Maybe those are those kind of, we might call them vocational, or whether they're, like for the same reason, like how were you drawn? I don't know. Sometimes these are things that come from deep within. It's kind of hard for me to say exactly. I think I might say, I have a certainly a love for the underdog as a theme, and I'm also kind of drawn to martyrs. So I think my perspective was always looking at that angle, and maybe being a Christian, and seeing the resonance of Christianity. One of the things that amazes me is that Black people in this country have been through so much, and yet did not see Christianity in with an antagonism, or see it as an antithesis, but rather had embraced it and Christianity had become such an important aspect of the African American experience. I'm generally speaking, broadly speaking, but the Black church, those were all important themes to me. Other people who have been abused by Christians do not see Christianity that way, saw Christianity as an antithesis, even as an enemy. And so I think it was fascinating to me. When you look at the Black Christian view, it's a whole different perspective, in a sense, on Christianity than what European and European Americans have done. So that's perhaps part of it.
So talk to us a little bit about John Brown. Many of those watching probably have no idea who John Brown is, or maybe they've seen something on PBS on the Civil War that gives John Brown 30 seconds to a minute of airtime.
Yes.
Tell us, who is John Brown?
That's a good question. Yeah, and I like that 30 seconds on PBS is exactly, and then usually it's blood drenched. So John Brown was actually, as we've discussed, he's a Connecticut-born person. His family moved to Ohio when he was 5 years old, which would have been in 1805. And they moved to the Connecticut's Western Reserve lands, which would be Northeast Ohio today. John Brown's grandfather was a colonial soldier for the Revolution, and his father had access to the land. So he grew up in Ohio. He was by religion a congregational Protestant. I would say that in many respects, which is what enthralls me, is that he was an evangelical in many respects, and yet he's kind of the unevangelical in terms of the contemporary view of what evangelical is today as a social movement. And he had actually had thought about being a minister. That didn't work out for him for reasons of, I think, deficiency in his education. He had some difficulties with his eyes. He largely then became and was agrarian. He was really representative of the agrarian North, I'd say, or the Northeast in the antebellum era. So born in 1800. By the 1840s, he had become involved in fine sheep and wool. He's usually reported as like the worst businessman who ever lived. He really wasn't. He actually came up in a very difficult time where there wasn't any federal bank. Andrew Jackson had dismantled that. There was no personal liability insurance, all that. So he had a lot of business knocks, but a lot of people did. They don't usually say that. But John Brown primarily was driven by his Christian faith and by his hatred of slavery. He got that, I think, in part from his father, who was an abolitionist, but he also got it from his own experience of seeing, by his own account, a young Black man being brutalized by a white, either slaveholder or somebody who had control over him. And he said that caused him to, swear, that he was going to fight slavery all of his life. He didn't emerge as a public figure until the 1850s. He went out to Kansas, and you may recall in the 1850s, the Kansas Territory was opened up. And of course, the subtext that means that white society was expanding into the Western states and the native populations were being displaced. So that's what settler issues always involve, whether we're talking about settler issues in the United States in the antebellum era or settler issues in Israel today, in Palestine, which is another point of interest that I think we share. But the reality was that as that new territory opened up, the big conversation in the 19th century at that period was, is Kansas going to become a free state or a slave state? Because up until that time, the slave states and the free states tried to maintain this sort of unholy compromise, which was every free state got a slave state and vice versa. And Kansas sort of blew that up. And Stephen Douglas, who was Abraham Lincoln's nemesis, had come up with this idea of this what was called moving from compromise to a vote-driven approach to say that if popular sovereignty determines a state, it will become either slave or free. Lots of northern people rushed to Kansas to make Kansas a free state. John Brown's sons, older sons, went out there. And then they started writing to him in 1855. He lived in the Adirondacks by that time. And there's a lot of story. He lived with a black colony of settlers from free people who had lived up in the Adirondacks. But he was himself planning a movement against slavery. But the Kansas thing kind of dropped on him. And his son said, look, we're in danger out here. All we have are guns to shoot squirrels and our tools. But we got all these Southerners are coming in and they're disrupting the democratic process. Essentially, they were domestic terrorists because what they were doing was intimidating voters, trying to force Kansas to become a slave state, even though the majority had clearly become free state people. Brown gathered weapons. He went out there really to protect his family, but he became involved in the political developments of Kansas. It was very clear that the Southern forces were outnumbered, but they were determined to invade the territory, disrupt voting. You know, it's sort of reminiscent in some ways. You think about what was happening in the South during the Civil Rights era, how they were trying to stop blacks from vote. So they were trying to stop Kansas from coming in as a free state. Brown got involved. And even though he was not a settler there, his sons were. And he got into a conflict. Now, typically, Chris, like when you said, you know, people know very little about Brown, and so they hear about him from PBS, one of the first things you hear is, oh, he killed 5 men in Kansas.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because
yeah.
I'm looking at your book, Fire from the Midst of You.
Yes.
And you write here, if I can quote, white Americans have long glorified violence and fanaticism when it pertained to their nationalistic interests. But you also note in that book that Brown was known, or maybe is known still, as the father of modern terrorism.
Yes.
So this is paradoxical here because we're talking about an evangelical Christian who has a deep faith in God, but comes to be known as the father of modern terrorism. How does that come about?
Well, the contemporary, I mean, unfortunately, those aren't what I would consider to be the truth tellers or the friends of John Brown. Look, I definitely am pro Brown in my view. I'm not going to twist the facts and the evidence. I just want to see the evidence clearly. So somebody about 20 years ago kind of labeled John Brown as the father of modern terrorism, which is what I was responding to in that book, which was 2002. But I would argue, of course, terrorism is as old as the country is, and the primary victims of terrorism have always been indigenous people or black people. I mean, the primary terrorism of the country. But John Brown's situation was simply this. His sons, they were abolitionists. They were notable, unapologetic, not only anti-slavery, Chris, because one of the things that we've all been miseducated about in this country is we've been taught that to be anti-slavery was to believe in equality, and it's not the case. Most anti-slavery people in the antebellum era were against slavery, but they were not racial egalitarians. People like Charles Finney, the evangelist, revivalist, all the way to Lincoln. None of them really were advocates of social equality. So the Browns were, and a small number of people tend to be, William Lloyd Garrison and others among the whites who believed black people and white people were equal, along with all other people. So the Brown family in Kansas were controversial because they were not only anti-slavery, but even among their own free state people, they were considered to be the extremists. This identified the Browns. And there were people neighbors who were attempting to lead terrorists against the Browns in May of 1856 with the intention of killing them or driving them off of their legal claims.
Yeah, this is really quite shocking to many, I would imagine. And you even write here, you said, beginning with the founding fathers, freedom and justice for black people was never intrinsic to the American dream, nor was it even so for Abraham Lincoln, the so-called great emancipator. Now, this is what I think we could fairly say is a radically different perspective of Lincoln than the one that's in the mind of many Americans. Would you
Yeah,
agree with that?
absolutely. Like, I don't know if you've seen Spielberg's story about Lincoln. It was just a fantastic undertaking. I mean, I'm critical. Frederick Douglass was critical of Lincoln, by the way. You can like Lincoln in a lot of ways and still be critical. On the standpoint of race, Lincoln was very typically a social racist. He didn't believe in slavery, but that doesn't mean that he was for human equality. So in that light, if you look at the Spielberg movie, what the screenplay writer did was took the very last, almost the last minutes or the last hours, really months of Lincoln's life, when Lincoln had belatedly crossed the line into understanding that he has to abolish slavery to win the war. Lincoln was never an abolitionist until the very end. Now, thank God that he did turn in the right direction, but he was really pulled in that direction by the forces and people who were criticizing him, and so he was not even the Emancipation Proclamation was really a political tool, because if you really look at it, it only emancipated enslaved people in Confederate states. So if there was a slave state loyal to the Union, like Missouri, Kentucky, others, there were a few others, mostly border states, those enslaved people were not liberated by the Emancipation Proclamation, because what Lincoln was trying to do was make sure that any enslaved people who came to the Union side could not be charged as stolen goods based on the Constitution, because slaveholders had, so yeah, the nation is a slave nation. John Brown called the United States that before he was hanged. He said, this is a slave nation. He didn't believe it was fundamentally or necessarily so, but he believed that it had become that in the 80-something years between independence and the antebellum era. So if you look at it, all the policies from the very beginning of this republic, the intention was to start removing the Indians, to start eliminating them. And there was prejudice involved, but there was also strategy there to remove them so that whites could expand and it could become a white nation. I think if we accept the fact that there were both good people, and I say good relatively to their personal lives, as well as really a lot of really horrible people, but their shared worldview was that this was a nation to be built for white people. And there were only a smaller number of people who essentially said that's not right and we don't like how it's done. And, this thing started, the whole frontier, as you know, the term frontier has to do with the pushing out of the nation and pushing out. And the frontier is always that part where settlers go that expands and expands. And as you're expanding, you're pushing people out. And then you're using slaves to build that new world that you've constructed. That's the history of the United States, whether people want to admit it or not. There's other things to say. There are freedoms and there are beauties about the nation. I'm not, despite my red shirt, I'm not, attacking the nation. But these are truths. And if we're not willing to admit these truths, we're not prepared to take a mature view of our nation. And so, and this is why John Brown is always kind of looked at, he killed these. Actually, they were aiding, abetting terrorists, but he killed them because they were directing, they were going to attack his own family, okay? Or he invaded Virginia to try to disrupt slavery, and then he gets branded as he wants to kill a lot of white people. Actually, that wasn't his intention at all. So I know that I could go on and on, but let me just say this. Our understanding of John Brown has largely been mediated through, number one, the Southern driven congressional report of 1860 that was supervised by James Mason of Virginia, by journalistic reports which were from Virginia screened so that there was only really one free state reporter who snuck in, and that's what I wrote about in my book about John Brown's last days. One free state reporter. All the other information about Brown that came out of Virginia came from pro-slavery papers sympathetic to the South or Southern papers. So we have our information from a majority pro-slavery report from the Senate, from the media, the journalism of that day that was largely pro-slavery, and the biases of early and mid 20th century scholars who insisted John Brown was crazy. That was the trope of the 20th century, is that John Brown was a madman. Today, the trope is he was a terrorist. But the problem is that, in fact, the guy he's the boogeyman in the backyard of white society. For Black people, of course, they always knew just the opposite, that he was probably one of the several good friends that the Black community had, and that he wasn't a terrorist. He was actually trying to end a terroristic reality in the country. So, and the fact that he was a Christian is even more amazing, because for instance, we know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I don't see any Christians getting upset that Bonhoeffer even was part, at least trying to support an effort to kill Hitler. I don't consider that's a problem. But a guy who was trying to end slavery in our country is considered an anathema. So, as you started by saying, either people don't know John Brown or the image they have of him is a caricature. So this is what we have after 100 years of very intentional misrepresentation, even to the 1940 film called Santa Fe Trail.
That was with Ronald Reagan, right?
You got it, yeah. Ronald Reagan is one of the heroes. And notice all the heroes in Santa Fe Trail are Southern figures. And John Brown is portrayed as a madman. And that movie gave the cultural definition of John Brown. I think even up until now, it's starting to wear away. There's a tipping taking place where we're starting to see a different sensibility. But a lot of scholars who are now no longer willing to attack John Brown explicitly are still saying things like, yes, but his violence is very upsetting to us. And I'm...
Oh, go ahead, please.
You know, that his violence has to be placed in the context of what he was up against. And also, the violence that's inherently part of the culture to see what is done on a daily basis to Black people. Yeah. And the indifference of most whites.
So let's talk about the violence for a minute, because the violence is directly tied to Harpers Ferry, which in the opinion of many is where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, about Harpers Ferry, we could say—
John Brown's role in Harpers Ferry.
Yeah, so he had a plan. Now there's two levels very quickly. John Brown had a plan for about 25 years that he wanted to enter into the South, and he wanted to disrupt the operations of slavery. He understood that up until that time, and he studied slavery, studied insurrectionary movements, he studied the movements of Black people in the United States and elsewhere, and he concluded he did not want to support an insurrection. Insurrection is servile war. In insurrection, you arm slaves to kill masters. We had examples, small versions of that. For instance, Nat Turner in 1831. When Nat Turner revolted, and I'm not upset by the revolt, but let's just talk explicitly. When Nat Turner revolted, he knew that if he was going to successfully liberate himself, he had to kill his slaveholder. And when he did that, he not only killed slaveholders, he killed the heirs of slaveholders. So it's a picture of what an insurrection is. An insurrection involves murdering and killing and murdering slaveholders so that you remove any legal claim upon yourself, okay? John Brown did not want to have an insurrection. He wanted to destroy the function and operations of slavery. So what he intended to do was go into Virginia and begin to lead people out of slavery, break them into cadres, hide them all in the Allegheny Mountains that went down into the South. And he wanted to fight only in self-defense, but he primarily wanted to create instability, uncertainty in slavery, so that if you disrupt slavery in Virginia, slaveholders will begin to sell their slaves into North Carolina. And then You do that in North Carolina, and you just disrupted. James Redpath, his first biographer, who was somewhat of a stylist, but nevertheless said he wanted to disrupt slavery from Virginia to the Gulf of Mexico. This is precisely what he wanted to do. He also wanted to enlist anti-slavery people, even in the South, white people who were against slavery. He wanted to create a social political movement that would overthrow the stability of slavery as a system. That's what he wanted to do. But again, the Virginians, the Southerners, have given us the story of the Harpers Ferry raid. So what he really wanted to do at Harpers Ferry at the Armory was to make a demonstration, and he wanted to seize it. What the Southerners said from the beginning, and I find no evidence of it being true, they said he wanted to steal the weapons and arm all the black people with weapons. The truth of it is that he had superior weapons that he got from the North. They were Sharps repeating rifles. The weapons that were made at Harpers Ferry were breech loading, and he wasn't interested in them. Number two, he didn't make any provision to seize them. Number three, he didn't remove them during the occupation of Harpers Ferry. And number four, after, he denied that he had any interest in the weapons. And yet the Southerners gave us this story. What did he want to do? He wanted to make a demonstration. And this is why, I understand why, is that in 1856, while he was in Kansas, pro-slavery people raided a federal arsenal in Missouri and took the weapons to use against Free State people in Lawrence, Kansas. And the United States government never prosecuted and never pursued any sort of political action about that taking. So Brown was trying to make, and this comes from even those who interviewed him after, he was trying to make a demonstration. My sense is he wanted to go into Harpers Ferry. He wanted to seize maybe 100, 200, 300 enslaved people from the area and go into the mountains, but he wanted to stick his finger in the eye of the Buchanan administration, because they were a Democratic pro-slavery administration. And he wanted to make the point, you didn't prosecute the seizure of the arsenal. I am going to sit and hold this while I gather enslaved people. But that is what really happened. Now, unfortunately, he delayed too much. He was apprehended. He was defeated. Many of his men were killed, and he was put on trial for, interestingly, treason against Virginia, which is an interesting topic. He was blamed as an insurrectionist, and he was tried for that, and so he was hanged on December 2nd, 1859.
Well, now you alluded to Bonhoeffer before,
yes,
and his role in the attempt to assassinate Hitler. And so this raises an interesting theological question. Many of those watching have a vested interest in biblical theology. So how is the situation with Brown similar to and different from what Bonhoeffer was dealing with, in your opinion?
Well, I have maybe a basic knowledge of Bonhoeffer, but my attempt will be to say, for the willingness to recognize that violence, in some degree, not a surrender to violence, because violence does not bring an answer, but that sometimes there are people or evils that must be confronted with force, lest they dominate. And I think Bonhoeffer understood that Hitler was a problem. Hitler and those closest to him needed to be eliminated. And had they been successful in killing Hitler, we would have been better off in history. So in that sense, John Brown is saying to a generation of nonviolent abolitionists who all they did was pray and preach. And he was saying to them, we have to do something to use of a measure of force, because slavery is a violent and ruthless institution, and it's not giving up ground, and they don't care what you have to say. And so in that sense, he and Bonhoeffer are similar, because they both see that some measure of violence has to be used against evil. But at the same time, not believing that violence, or the God of war, if you will, is the God of Scripture, but rather the priority is to be concerned for those who, as John Brown called them, who are always on the underhill side, those who are the oppressed and the downcast. So in that sense, they are similar. How are they different? Obviously, the historical circumstances are different. Obviously, Bonhoeffer was concentrating on a very evil man and a corrupt cadre of people who supported him. Brown was trying to destroy an institution. He really did not have a hatred of Southern people, and his own family bore this up. They said sometimes he corrected them at home when they were children. When they talked badly about Southern people, he would actually correct them and say, it's what they've learned. It's this system that's evil. This system is what he's trying to excise. And he knows that if he goes on a killing spree, that's not going to solve the problem. But he's got to do something to destroy slavery, because if you look at where we were in and this may be another parallel, where was Germany in the time when Bonhoeffer was? There was no hope that the people of Germany were going to in any way put an end to Hitler. And if you look at where we were in this country in 1859, we had the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which essentially said that the entire country was subject to the priorities of slaveholders. And then we had the 1857 Dred Scott decision that said, essentially, as Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court justice, said, a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. So by the time you get to 1859, there is not any immediate hope or way toward emancipation. There is no way. Not within the bounds of what is considered to be systemic, political, legal, democratic process. John Brown said, I got to make a hole in this wall. I've got to make a crack in this wall, and I'm going to do it by trying to undermine what is that system that the Dutch used when they threw the wooden shoe into the machinery, the sabotage. He was trying to sabotage slavery in the hopes that slavery could be disrupted, that this would bring about a social and political tumult in the nation. I believe he actually wanted to bring his case before the federal government, which is another reason why I think he attacked a federal armory. Even though it was in a southern state, there were only 2 federal armories before the Civil War. One was in Springfield, Massachusetts, where he had lived, and one was in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. He attacked federal property. And I think my thought is that he was wrong, but in attacking Harpers Ferry, even if he was busted, he could then be on trial in a federal case that would create a political upheaval. Either way, he felt like that something was going to happen that would challenge slavery because there was otherwise no challenge.
So you're painting a very different picture of him than the popular conception. He's described oftentimes as a madman. What I'm hearing you say is that he was making very calculated decisions to undermine the institution of slavery. Yeah,
this is a man who studied the system for 30, 40 years, actually, all of his life, certainly all his adult life. And he saw, and Chris, if you look at where we were as a nation in the early 1800s, there was an optimism among the anti-slavery people who were small in number, but there was a general consensus that slavery was phasing out. And this is probably also why some of the founders went along with the pro-slavery founders, that they thought this is not really going to last. So, it was really not a good compromise. We would look at it and say it was a sinful compromise. But for them, they thought history was going to go against slavery. But what happened was, as you know, the cotton gin, and by the 1840s, the pro-slavery force had become dominant in the nation. And by the 1850s, as I said, they had it pretty much sewn up. And their intention really was, and this is something that they say John Brown's attack on Harpers Ferry, brought about the Civil War only in the sense that, only in a very superficial sense, as far as I'm concerned. There were leaders in the South 10 years before Lincoln's election who wanted to secede from the Union. And what we have to understand is the Southern powers did not want to fight the Civil War simply to protect slavery. Lincoln offered them the protection of slavery in 1860. He told them, keep your slaves, just don't expand. And that was the real issue. What we have to understand is that in the antebellum era, the objective of the pro-slavery side, it was not simply to have slavery, it was to expand slavery. And Lincoln, who was no abolitionist, said you can't expand. And that's what started the Civil War. But 10 years before, there were people, radicals in Virginia and in South Carolina, who were already talking about secession. So John Brown, in his own way, yes, he did sort of force this, because after John Brown, everyone who was anti-slavery was, by the South, was labeled a John Brown, even though that actually was not at all true. Lincoln was no John Brown. He even disowned John Brown. He made it clear John Brown was no Republican. We don't have anything to do with him. But that doesn't matter, because the South had found someone to characterize the North. And in that sense, John Brown's, in fact, the last thing he wrote was, he said, John Brown, I had vainly, he said flattered, I had vainly, comforted myself with the idea that that slavery might end without much bloodshed. He said, but I now understand it's going to have to end with a lot of bloodshed. And he was right. Slavery didn't end on the basis of prayer, compromise, democratic politics. Slavery ended with a war.
Sounds very similar to what you find, say, in the book of Amos, which, I've taught for years and consider it to be in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, the work that is most concerned with social justice, or at least on par with the book of Deuteronomy. And what you see, especially in the first 2 chapters, is that God is intervening in human affairs through people and institutions to undermine and bring to an end sinful institutions. Yeah. And is it correct to say that that was John Brown's view of himself, that he in some ways was a modern day prophet, or did he see himself as an agent of God in what he was doing?
Well, yes, and you know what? It's interesting too. The Chicago Museum history has his Bible, has his prison Bible, and what he did was he went through the Bible, and he was such a devout believer in the Scripture. He did not want to add commentary, but what he did was he marked with his pen all the scriptures, many scriptures that signified justice and liberation, and of course, a lot in the Old Testament, and also, texts in the New Testament. He saw himself, and I think as a good Calvinist, he saw himself as providentially called. He didn't have this claim of being like a special revelation. He wasn't a Joan of Arc type person. But what he believed was that he was called. And I didn't mean he's the only one called, but he felt he was called. This was the purpose of his life, to bring in, and he was convicted that somehow he was going to bring an end to slavery. And the reality was that that's sort of what happened in his life. And you could say, well, it's self-fulfilling prophecy, but he really couldn't have known how it was going to turn out. But we do know that he really tried to do that. And he was driven by the prophetic, ethic. He was driven by, when he was in trial, he said, he went back to the golden rule, and he simply told the South, I have endeavored to treat people as Scripture says I should treat them, and so he would quote, maybe out of context, theologically, he quoted where Hebrews says, remember those in bonds as being bound with them. But I think his hermeneutic of liberation. It's interesting too. He quoted in one of his letters a phrase that James Cone, the Black liberation theologian, made a title. He talked about the God of the oppressed. So he was very steeped in Amos. He was very steeped. In fact, I think if there's one little piece of what might have been a sermon that he attempted to preach or preached, and it's inspired, I think it was from Amos. Yeah. So he's very much driven from what he thinks to be as a biblically call. This for him was a religious movement. He said it. He told interviewers when he was arrested, this is a religious movement. So again, he's been so reduced, diminished, caricatured, and lost not only to the history of the nation. The man who lived is not who is known, but he's been lost to his own church. Yeah. He's been lost to his own Christian community. They don't own him.
So I'm curious. I want to press in on this one a little bit. I've often heard it said, and I think if we're willing to generalize anyway, that in American Christianity, this is borne out, that oftentimes the churches that place an emphasis on orthodoxy, on correct belief, tend to fall short in orthopraxy, in living out the gospel. And then on the other hand, churches which are often considered to be liberal tend to do very well, practically speaking, social justice, that sort of thing, but doctrine falls by the wayside. And John Brown, it sounds to me from what you're describing, is that he was doing his best to do both, to live his life in a real way that benefited people, where he's doing the work of God, but it was rooted in what he believed to be a correct understanding of the scriptures. Would you agree with that?
I think that's beautifully stated. I'm ready to take up a speaker's offering for you, because I think that, no, I think that is really the problem. And you can see that cleavage even growing more and more when you look at the anti-slave, because in our country, the issue of slavery is seminal for even understanding liberalism and conservatism. And you're right. It seems like, even take someone like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass started as an evangelical in the 1830s. He was an AME pastor. Now, I mean, that wasn't his profession, but he became ordained as a minister, if I understand correctly. I'm not a biographer of Douglass, but if you look at Douglass's thinking, by the time he's in later life, he has moved toward liberalism. And many abolitionists who started out as evangelicals in the antebellum period ended as more liberals. They would call them today progressives. So this is a problem. Who were the most stalwart conservative, theologically speaking? They were either pro-slavery people or people who were saying, we don't like slavery, but we really shouldn't, we can't do anything but pray and wait. And John Brown, you're right. John Brown was like, I'm as committed to the Bible as any evangelical. I don't think they use that term popularly, but I'm as committed to the scripture as any good Protestant can be. Right. I believe in personal conversion to Jesus Christ. I believe in trusting in the word. He says this because a lot of his kids actually had rejected the gospel. So some of his letters, he talks more about Christianity than he does about slavery. It's a given in his family that slavery is evil. It's a given. I mean, everybody knows it. So he doesn't have to spend time convincing his kids about that, but he's trying to convince his kids to trust in Christ and believe in the word when they're spiritualists and going all sorts of directions. This guy's thoroughly evangelical, but he's bringing, as you say, orthodoxy and orthopraxy. He's trying to bring them together and say, why do we have to be politically and socially conservative just because we believe in the scriptures? We believe in Christ, in the resurrected Christ, and salvation by grace through faith, and all that stuff that we get from the Protestant Reformation. So yeah, I mean, this is a problem. And even if you look at this number of evangelicals today who want to be justice oriented, there's always a tension, because the moment you start talking about justice, there's a lot of this voice that comes from the right that says, I guess this is the right, that comes from the right that says, you're leftist, you're a communist, you're all this stuff that they throw up. They were doing this 60 years ago in the civil rights movement. It's the same thing. Anytime a Christian wants to speak for justice, the accusation comes is that this is the slippery slope toward liberalism, when in fact, it's the other way around. They've set it up that way, in my opinion. And that's why evangelicals don't own John Brown. There's more likely they're going to own Bonhoeffer. Even though Bonhoeffer wasn't as evangelical, quote unquote, as Brown was in his personal faith. Now, Brown wasn't a theologian, but he was a biblically minded layperson. But evangelicals in this country will admire Bonhoeffer from a distance because the bad people in that story is not them. It's not their fathers. It's not their grandfathers.
Right.
We have to admit that the forefathers of this country were wrong and that they did wrong. And until we can do that, and I think that's why John Brown is so odious to them, because of what he says.
Yeah, if I heard you correctly before, you made a statement, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the United States is in many respects a wonderful country. And we can talk about liberties that we have today, social advantages and opportunities, economic opportunities that are not found in other countries. Is it possible to hold that view and still be critical of American history?
I believe the prophetic ethic and the gospel ethic requires we do. I think, we, just like we can say, anthropologically, we can say humans are made in the image of God. We are imago Dei, but we're fallen. And if we can say that, I'm trying to use language that is probably the most negotiable in terms of a broader theology. But sure. I think most people in theology would say there's a fallenness to our condition, and there's a fallenness, but there's a beauty to our condition. So why would that not be true about our cities, states, our nation states, our communal life? It is both beautiful and it is fallen. And so if we're not willing to acknowledge the fallenness and the blindness that has protected the injustices, then right. So there's no contradiction in that. I think, and you would know more about this, but I would say that the prophets were really the patriots of Israel. They were really the people who loved the country, because they were the most concerned. The kings and the people who abused, they didn't really love the country. They didn't love God or country. They just loved power. And so I would argue that, again, that's why I think John Brown needs to be appreciated first by the Christian community. I'm not interested in getting John Brown, selling him to the Black community. The Black community has its own history of leaders. And I've said this in lectures. I've said, I'm not interested in trying to push John Brown on Black people and say, oh, you should really respect. No, I want little white children to learn about John Brown and know him for who he was, because I think, I may be wrong, Chris, but I think there's going to be a time when the reassessment of our history is inevitably going to come, and we're going to be groping, so-called white people are going to be groping for people, looking back and saying, where are the good people? Where are the people who were consistent? Because Lincoln's great, and I lament that he was killed, and I lament the loss that represented. But in the end, Lincoln was, as Douglas said this, he was a white man's president first. If you don't believe me, it's in his third autobiography. There's a speech he made, which he included, and he told a group of white people in Washington, D.C., I think 1870, he said, Lincoln was first and foremost your president, not ours. He didn't say that about John Brown. About John Brown, he said, when John Brown lifted his arm, the sky was cleared. In other words, no more compromise, no more obfuscation, no more delusions about who we are. Let's be clear about this. Yeah.
Is there a John Brown today on the world stage, whether in the United States or on the broader global scene?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm equipped to say that. It would be nice to see. Maybe there's a little bit of John Brown in everybody who wants to fight for freedom, so in some ways, these characters are in some ways seminal, and then they become part of their own context. But I think there'll always be somebody who's gripped by a John Brown or by others who love history, who see in history a way of embracing the present, struggle for justice. We have to always struggle for justice, but we ought not to let go of the cross. I mean, as Christians, I think it's always the gospel. We have to be driven, and we have to return to the gospel in every move we make, or else we will end up becoming just revolutionaries or nihilists or whatever. And so we have to believe in the gospel. So maybe circumstantially we don't need a John Brown, at least in the United States. Like I know there's gun clubs, and some of them name themselves after John Brown. But again, people don't seem to appreciate the fact that where we were as a nation in 1859, there simply was no out. And I thank God that there was a Christian man who had a plan and had boots on the ground and who tried. And at least he tried. And in trying, he failed. But in his failure, something else happened. And I can't say this as a historian, but I can say it as a Christian. I can see, you can see the shadows of providence in that. God works in history in his own ways. And I think in that sense, all the people that were brought together, even Lincoln is part of the story of God, what God has done. Black people liberating themselves, struggling for justice, speaking out. This is part of God's way in history. But John Brown he just deserves his place. I want Christians to recognize that he was one of us.
Well, from what I'm hearing, it's what I'm learning about John Brown and what I've learned in reading your works is that by studying John Brown, by looking at this figure in American history, even today, from beyond the grave, he's challenging us with questions of what it means to live out our Christianity. And I hope that as viewers watch this and come back and watch it again, perhaps, and as they listen to your podcast and read your books, that they're challenged to ask questions that most are uncomfortable to ask in the church today. On behalf of all of the listeners, I just want to thank you for making the time for this enlightening discussion on John Brown. The history buffs among us and the biblical scholars and theologians among us are all going to benefit from this conversation. And I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's good to see you. Good to speak with you.
All right. Great to talk to you as always, my friend. All right. Thank you, everybody. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe to our channel and make sure to like the video and ring the bell so that you're notified when new videos like this appear. Thanks for watching today, everybody.